Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special conversation with Adjunct Professor Glenn Johnston OAM. I'm delighted to have this conversation with Glenn because it's an important topic to all professionals working across procurement and supply throughout Australia and arguably globally as well. So Adjunct Professor Glenn Johnston OAM is a proud Parramatta man of the Darug Nation. He is nationally recognised and respected senior Aboriginal who is passionate about developing Aboriginal business sector, creating economic equity and employment opportunities. With an executive leadership career of over 30 years, Glenn has led large procurement, supply chains and commercial teams, delivering excellent customer service and outcomes for a wide range of diverse stakeholders. He is adjunct professor at the University of New South Wales and has delivered training and development postgraduate programs for private and public sector organisations for over a decade. His main area of expertise includes leadership, integrity, governance, procurement, diversity, reconciliation and social justice. He is one of only 100 Australian-based fellows of the global peak body for procurement professionals, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. He holds a master's degree of logistics management from the Sydney University Graduate School of Business. He sits on the Australian Institute of Company Directors, New South Wales Council, and is a member of the AICD NFP Chairs Advisory Forum. And in addition to all of this, he further sits on several other not-for-profit boards as a non-executive director. So, Glenn, it's a tremendous privilege to have you along for this conversation, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. Great to be here.
So, perhaps by way of setting the scene, can you please explain what the term Indigenous procurement means and why it's so important?
Indigenous procurement is the deliberate inclusion of Indigenous-owned and controlled businesses in organisational supply chains. But for me, it is much more than a procurement policy or a spend target. It is an economic empowerment strategy. When we buy from an Indigenous business, we create a multiplier effect. Business growth, employment, skills, intergenerational wealth, and greater self-determination. Procurement professionals control significant economic levers. The question is whether we simply buy goods and services or whether we use that purchasing power to create broader economic and social value. Indigenous procurement is procurement for good.
How does Indigenous procurement differ today in terms of industry engagement for Indigenous owned businesses in the public and private sectors compare to when you first started your career as a procurement professional?
The change has been extraordinary. When I started my procurement career, Indigenous businesses were largely invisible in corporate and government supply chains. Today we have Indigenous procurement policies, targets, reporting frameworks, and organisations such as Supply Nation, helping connect buyers and Indigenous suppliers. However, I would describe the progress as significant but incomplete. We have moved from awareness to participation, but we now need to move from participation to scale. The next challenge is not simply increasing the number of Indigenous suppliers. It is creating larger, sustainable Indigenous businesses capable of competing for major contracts and becoming strategic supply partners.
Can you provide some examples, Glenn, where Indigenous procurement works well, and perhaps, if possible, an example from both the public sector and perhaps what you've seen to go well in the private sector as well?
In the public sector, Indigenous procurement works best when there are clear targets, executive accountability, and procurement teams actively identifying opportunities rather than waiting for suppliers to approach them. In the private sector, the strongest examples are organisations that embed Indigenous procurement into commercial strategy, category planning, and supplier relationship management. The major difference is often accountability. Governments can create policy mandates and targets. Private sector adoption can depend heavily on leadership commitment and organisational culture. My view is simple. Indigenous procurement succeeds when it moves from being a RAP initiative or a procurement KPI and becomes part of how the organisation does business.
And in terms of risks, recognising that for many procurement professionals across public and private sector environments, this might be something new or newish to them, what types of risks do they need to be aware of, and how can they deal with those risks?
We need to be careful not to assume Indigenous businesses inherently present greater procurement risk. That assumption itself can become a barrier. The risks are generally the same for any supplier: financial capacity, operational capability, contract concentration, workforce capacity, and governance. For emerging businesses, rapid growth can create additional scaling pressures. The answer is not to exclude them, it is to manage the risk intelligently. Use proportionate due diligence, appropriate contract sizing, staged growth, supplier development, and strong relationship management. I am also very conscious of black cladding, or as it is more correctly known, fraud. Buyers must undertake appropriate verification to ensure Indigenous ownership, control, and genuine economic benefits are real.
For ambitious, aspirational procurement professionals who are seeking to build out their portfolio Indigenous supplies, what advice would you give to them?
My first advice is get out from behind the procurement portal. Meet Indigenous businesses, attend supplier events, build relationships, listen and understand their capability before an opportunity goes to market. Secondly, look at your category pipeline and identify opportunities early. Do not wait until the tender is released and then ask, are there any Indigenous suppliers? Thirdly, challenge unnecessary barriers such as turnover requirements, insurance levels, contract size, and excessive tender complexity. And finally, measure more than spend. Look at Indigenous employment, business growth, capability, and long-term sustainability. A good Indigenous procurement is not about lowering standards. It is about widening opportunity and creating genuine competition.
And in doing so, I suppose that echoes the best of the category management strategy, diversification of supply chains. So those dividends and payoffs are certainly beyond perhaps the narrow initial thinking in terms of Indigenous and Aboriginal owned businesses. For people who are looking for more information, for more guidance, are there any recommendations perhaps in the public domain that you would suggest to people, Glenn?
Absolutely, Paul. I would refer anyone who is interested in exploring Indigenous supplies to go onto the Supply Nation website, which is supplynation.org.au, and there is a raft of information there. Also look at their local, their state government procurement websites. Even private sector can learn from what the government is doing. As I said in my earlier comments, the government can set the policies and the processes, and they've done a very good job nationally and state-based on that over the last 5 to 7 years. So there's some really good information available there.
Fantastic. That's excellent, Glenn. Thank you so much for sharing those insights and for the great work you're doing in this critically important space as well. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Paul.